earlier. You were saying how there was the spike on 9/11 a little bit before that first plane hit the tower, which sort of begs this interesting question: is like, have there been some, I guess, meaningful speculations around what that spike represented? I mean, it felt like consciousness was sort of tapping into something prior to it actually happening on a global level, which makes me think a little bit about, I know HeartMath's research kind of suggests that the heart has an intuitive intelligence that I think can sense events, don't quote me, but I think it's somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 seconds prior to it happening, but we're talking 2 hours here on a global consciousness level. What sort of speculations have been there around what that was exactly?
Many. And it's still being debated as to what this means. There's no question that there was a statistically significant effect that showed up prior to the plane striking and persisted for many hours for the rest of 9/11. I personally relate to that as something that we see very often in psi research, which is kind of the term for mind over matter research or parapsychology research. And that's that time-delayed events are very common. So you can do an experiment where you would try to attempt to affect a random number generator slightly in the future or slightly in the past, and you can have the same sort of results. So the time domain of these things doesn't seem to be quite as relevant as it is in normal forces that we think about. There was experiments by Spottiswoode and May and later Daryl Bem at Cornell. Daryl Bem is like one of the grandfathers of modern sociology. He's the man. And what he did is he hooked participants up to a device that read basically the muscular tension in their finger. And he showed them a series of images, and those images ranged from a pastoral picture, some forests, a happy dog, and then occasionally at random times, one of those images would be something provocative, like a violent scene or a naked woman or something like that. And he found that the participants' fingers would tense up in the seconds before being shown one of the provocative images. So you can do this experiment over and over again, and you can put all the data together. And he found something like, I believe it was odds of 74 billion to 1.
Wow.
That this is an effect due to chance. It's clearly not. So there's something about the human being itself, about human consciousness, probably our subconscious, that seems to be tuned to the near future and responds to it. And that makes perfect sense because you think about all the stuff you have to be attuned to in the near future just for your own survival, driving a car or these types of things. So with the Global Consciousness Project data on September 11th, it could be that what you're seeing is something like a collective effect of that presentiment effect. But there's also this possibility that because of these time-delayed effects, after the events of September 11th unfolded, and I guess probably even for years thereafter, because that was so significant, when you go back and look at the data, by going back and looking at the data, you have an expectation, or the experimenters have an expectation that there's going to be some sort of effect. Like there's got to be an effect on September 11th, right? It was the most significant day of the last century. And so you go back and you look at the data, and of course there's an effect, right? And it can happen even a couple of hours beforehand. So it's always really difficult to parse out whether or not something is an actual presentiment effect or whether something is a time-delayed retroactive or retrocausal effect backwards in time.
Right.
That's really the discussion. It's not so much, is the data real? It's, is this retrocausality or is it presentiment? Is it a collective experimenter effect among the people doing the experiment or the people that are looking at the results and reading about it? Or are you actually measuring something called global consciousness with these, devices spread around the world? That's really the question I think that needs to be answered.
Yeah, it's like a chicken and an egg type situation, right? So it's like I'm sort of unpacking this a little bit in my head as you're sort of expressing it. It's almost like really looking at what is the effect on consciousness, on our reality, from the standpoint of, like, once, let's say we were looking at it from a linear time perspective, right? Where it's like, okay, there's time, which is kind of how we perceive things and how we've come to culturally perceive our reality. It's almost like once something happens, it sort of sticks. But what you're kind of saying is something could happen. There may not be a sort of massive focus or a massive spike per se, and from a consciousness point of view, but you could actually decide that that was a very meaningful event later in perceptual time, look back, and then suddenly see a spike. And you would kind of never really know the difference, which kind of leads to this, it goes back to the double slit experiment and the observation effect, obviously, which is kind of what this is all about. It's like, it leads to that big question, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there, did it actually happen? Did it make a sound,
Yep.
so to speak, right? Which is a fascinating thing that I'm just still wrapping my mind around, kind of what to draw in terms of meaning from a lot of this, because I think that's kind of the tendency we have is like, what's the value of exploring? I mean, this is actually a fair question to you right now. Is like, what's the value of exploring this stuff from your perspective and experience so far?
I think that science is not a substitute for truth. And that sounds like kind of a crazy thing to say, but I'll explain. I think that the truth is something that should free you. When you hear the truth, you should have a sense of being freed somehow, right? Freed from incorrect assumptions or freed from uncertainty. And science doesn't do that. Science, if done properly, it produces data. It can show you objective facts, but it only points at a truth that is metaphysical. And what I mean by that is that the meaning of experiments, the meaning of science, the meaningfulness of it comes from us, right? So it comes from our interpretation. I think that there's a tendency to conflate science with truth, and Lord knows that we need more science and objective reasoning in the world, absolutely. But it doesn't tell you, it shouldn't tell you what its meaningfulness is.
Yeah.
If there was any one thing after decades and decades of psi research that would tell somebody when to know if you're getting an effect and when effects will show up, it's meaningfulness. So like anomalies or effects really accumulate around meaningfulness in an experiment. That's true not just of random number generators, but probably true of every experiment that any scientist does, period. If it's meaningful to them, then you're generally going to get effects surrounding it. They don't want to admit that, but it's probably very true. Jonathan Schooler, I believe he's at Santa Cruz or Santa Barbara. He did some profound work looking at decline effects. So a decline effect is where you'll do an experiment for the first time and you get amazing results. And then this is true of psychology, biology, right, whatever. And then you'll do it a few more times and the effects decline, right? Kind of reverts back to the mean, if you will, or to no effect. Mm-hmm. So a traditional way of looking at that would be, oh, well, it didn't survive replication.
Right.
You thought you did something wrong in the experiment, and so you're not getting the same effects. A consciousness meaningfulness perspective, however, would interpret that completely differently and would say, look, you as the experimenter are really excited because you thought you were a clever guy and you were going to reveal something, that was going to be career making. And so you did this experiment. Of course it worked. Of course it worked. The first time you do something is often very successful, right? And but then the second and third time when the meaningness subsides, the effects decline. So, I mean, that's really the big thing that I've learned in all of this stuff, is that you cannot divorce the experimenter from the experiment. And we, like, our minds and we're inclined to try to believe and interpret things a certain way and to hold on to our beliefs about things and interpretations a certain way because they connect to our other meaningfulness systems. And those are really powerful and they can generate results, but it's not necessarily what you think it is. I'll tell you a funny story about this. About 10 years ago, Buddy and I were trying to figure out how to create a psychic machine. In other words, one of the problems of trying to get reliable psychic information from a human psychic is that, well, it's got reliability problems. So they don't always, they inject all of their own assumptions and interpretations into it. And so you're not really sure where the true signal, the psychic signal is, and where interpretation, like, left brain interpretation of things are that can become wrong. So if you could remove the human from it and just have a machine that was somehow a psychic machine tapped into, the quantum field or whatever it is that sort of connects us, then maybe you could have much more reliable psychic information. Maybe you could even sort of predict the future. So we were thinking about how to do this. And we thought about this experiment that I just mentioned with Spottiswoode and May and Daryl Bem, where they were measuring the subtle clenching of our muscles prior to being shown a provocative image. Like, that's it. We're gonna have a machine that's going to react somehow to an event in the future that's going to scare it. So like, okay, how do we scare a machine? Suppose you could hit it, or you could shock it, or dump water on it, and you sort of measure the machine and see if it freaks out prior to being, shocked or scared or something. And figure that actually the way you would do it is you'd pull the power. That's how you kill an electric machine, is that you just cut the power.
One question, just to interject on that. Is this also, in essence, trying to determine whether or not that machine is, in a sense, self-aware?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So to build a psychic machine is also to build a conscious machine.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But without presumably anyway, without the psychology involved,
right,
which kind of messes up the psychic signal, then the idea is that you probably get like pure signal from it or something. We're just playing here, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so we took this random number generator and we built a system that recorded its output, so it's constantly outputting ones and zeros. And then we have this other random system that at random times just suddenly cuts the power to the first one. So that there's no way of telling when the power is going to be cut, but we're recording the output of like the victim, if you will.
Right.
So I leave this thing running overnight and I come back in the morning and I look at the data and the power has been cut like 3 or 4 times during the night. Then I look at the output of the random number generator, and within 2 or 3 seconds before the power is cut, there's this huge drop. Like it just goes 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, like tons of zeros, right? And you put them all together, so you line up all the moments in which the power is cut with all of the data and like the minutes or seconds before the power is cut. Just kind of aggregate it. And it was significant on the order of like 10 million to 1 or something. So it was like, whoa, this machine totally predicted, the future, like at least 3 seconds before it actually happened. So I packed this up and I sent it to my friend Garrett Medell, who's an engineering professor at CU, very qualified, competent gentleman who runs his own lab and all of that. So he gets his grad students to rebuild the device and just building it up from scratch. And he runs the same experiment that we ran. Again, tens of millions to 1 that this happened. Seems to be predicting the future. He's super excited now because he's like, this is incredible. Like, we built a conscious machine that's going to change AI. Not only that, but you can totally predict the stock market or something like that. Right? So it's very meaningful to him, right, to do this, because he's excited again about science and about doing something completely new. So I think we did 3 or 4 replications, all of which were very successful. Cumulatively, the output of these were greater than something like 2 billion to 1, more significant than the entire global consciousness database over 25 years put together. So now he moves into this, psychologically, he moves into this next phase of, well, the meaningfulness is reduced. And it's more about how do we, like, where do we go from here? So what are the nuts and bolts of this? Does another experiment, no results. Does another experiment, no results. Changes everything back to the way it used to be. Another experiment, nothing. To this day, it's never worked since. So it declined, it went, from crazy significance and declined down into indistinguishable from chance. So how do you interpret that? Well, did we change some variable in the experiment? Did we use different devices? No. Like, you could go down the list of things and it's not there. The only change is the psychology, and in particular the meaningfulness of the experimenters involved that declined and that produced the decline.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think about it, I think about the, we'll say it's a current human challenge, but I would say even specific to Western culture, it might be a little bit more of a human challenge to be so analytical, be so mind-driven. And almost the feeling that I got when I was listening to what you were saying, just kind of paying attention to just even the subtleness of like what I was feeling listening to it, I was like, if we assume there is a field of consciousness that does connect us all and that is inherently, connected to everything, and if that field of consciousness is aware and intelligent, and if its tendency is towards evolution, like constant evolution, then you might assume that if the wholeness of that is observing, in a sense, the individual experience, this is kind of complex in terms of like, how would it be separate from the whole? But what I'm kind of saying? Like, if almost the collective consciousness aspect of it is somehow able to tap in or observe the sort of individual experience of wanting to explore consciousness, and if in a sense it knew that the current experience of humans at that moment was that of tendency towards pure logical exploration, it would provide, or it would allow results that allow the human to come to terms with the fact that there's something more than just the mind, that there is a conscious relationship, to which should be enough to say, we're something deeper, i.e. we're evolving. But then the human, through free will, steps back into identifying back with the mind, but there's no more purpose anymore to show meaningfulness because it was already there. You're just kind of now in overkill mode. That's kind of the feeling that I got when I was listening to it. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, well, okay, so there's a reason why meditation teachers and gurus will tell you not to focus on the cities or the weird phenomena or sensations that happen. Don't get caught up in that, because you'll have this profound experience and then the next day you'll go try to recreate that and it's not there. Like, you can't because the point isn't to try to recreate these experiences that were meaningful to you in the past.
Right.
If you're doing that, you're not learning from them. The point is to stay in touch with the pure awareness that is you, right?
Present moment.
And all those other phenomena and meaningfulness, that's great, but they're time sensitive, right? So there's a deeper point here, like what you're saying, which is to, in this sort of trickster way, which is to get you to think that you've really uncovered something that is different from something pure, like your pure awareness or pure consciousness. Or maybe some sort of pure path, and it will lead you through this meaningfulness phenomena, it will lead you astray, and you're going to follow it, and you should follow it in the beginning, if only to know that it was actually you all along that you were
Right.
chasing.
Yeah.
People often ask me, with this entangled app, looking at collective consciousness that you want to do, don't you think that the military or like the CIA or something is going to appropriate it or try to take it over? And I mean, I don't know, certainly not entangled, but with respect to the military or intelligence agencies' interest in these subject matters, their interest in the subject matters is going to be, how do we amplify it? How do we amplify the psychic signal, the telekinesis or the psychokinesis or whatever? And so they're going to create these, these black programs that are well-funded to try to get people to, reproduce these phenomena. And they're going to tweak something, change some variable, and get some sort of effect. And they're like, aha, we figured it out.
Yeah.
And then they're going to pursue that a little bit more, and then it's going to go away. And then, oh shit, if we do this other thing, then we're going to get a stronger effect. Now we figured it out. And they're going to, so basically you're going to keep following this stuff and keep following this stuff until the point where you realize that you're just chasing your own tail of meaningfulness. And you're going to end up exactly where you were. So I actually don't think that these programs have really developed much beyond where everyone else is, to be honest.
Yeah.
I certainly believe that they've tried, but I actually don't think that they're further along than is assumed maybe in the conspiracy community.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting question that I've been people who are watching this may be like, yeah, Joe, you've been talking about this the last few videos. It's this whole idea of, you mentioned earlier in the conversation, you were talking about how we have this tendency to want to move past uncertainty, right? So know something for certain. We have this tendency to want to really just utilize science as a way of saying, yes, this is true 100% of the time, so to speak. And perhaps there's times where we can say that, and there's other times where we can't, and there's other times where we think there's no meaning, where there might actually be meaning, or we have this whole dance with science. But it leads to this sort of interesting moment, because while you were finishing that sentence, you also stated that the world does need a little bit more reasoning, a little bit more logic, a little bit more critical thinking, if you will. We seem to be in a time of, especially even with COVID, but certainly prior to COVID as well, where controversial ideas, or what are called conspiracy theories, or alternative versions of history, reality, facts about current events, seem to be like extremely popular amongst people. I know we've been doing this work for a long time, but it's like, it almost feels like there's a whole other mass of people that are kind of saying, you know what, I'm really listening right now. And I've kind of observed something that's really hitting me like a 2x4 in the head. And it's kind of been lightly tapping me for like a year. And now it's like, you know what I'm saying? Which is why I'm talking about it lately. But it's this idea of it almost feels as though a lot of the, and there's no real easy way to define this, so I'm going to just do my best to contextualize it, but there's almost like this like alternative or conspiracy type community, right, that I'm really recognizing like has kind of thrown critical thinking to the wind. And I'm not saying it's all people. I'm saying there's a large amount of people where it's almost like they're not critically thinking anymore because they've decided on what the truth is. And so you kind of have mainstream media and alternative media say, right? And on one hand, we're getting a narrative that's like, from the mainstream, perhaps it's like, we know it's compromised, there's corruption involved, so on and so forth, so we're looking for more. And the alternative community has, in some ways, kind of become just as ideological as the mainstream community, but about different things. Because there's this sense that we want to be certain about exactly what's going on. And like, I'm curious to get like some of your take on this, because I just feel as though we're at a critical juncture where we absolutely need to be having these important conversations, yet we're kind of leaning towards pretending like we know so many things so certainly about how our world works and who's running it and what's going on, when in reality there's a lot more uncertainty that we need to admit to in order to really make sense of what's going on.
So much to say there. It's true that just because we might have knowledge of the conspiracy world doesn't mean that we're awake.
Absolutely.
A proper awakening is something that happens inside you, and it doesn't deal with particular pieces of information that can trigger it, right? But it's I mean, you could say it's learning to think for yourself, but actually I think what it is it's to become awake, right? Is to be aware of when it's not you that's doing the thinking inside your head.
Right.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there's definitely been a lot more people that are trying to find answers, and they're finding answers in let's say broadly the conspiracy of the alternative world for a couple of reasons. One is that if you're going by the mainstream and you're trying to figure out why things are happening, good luck. There's no way that you're going to make sense of this, let alone predict what's coming next. However, if you do kind of come from an inculcation in the conspiracy world, everything makes sense.
Yeah.
It all makes perfect sense. It makes so much sense you can predict what's going to happen next, right? So, and that's because a lot of it is true. And it's the only thing that is consistent in a world of complete chaos for people right now. And so, of course, they're gravitating to it. And they're also being told, don't look there, don't look there.
Right.
Ban everything, right? So, you know, we know what that means. But just because it's unconventional and conspiracy stuff doesn't make it true. Just because you know these things doesn't mean you're awake.
Right.
Sorry, it's just not that easy.
Right.
And I know that because I've made mistakes before, and I continue to make them in this regard. One thing that let's COVID or the riots or just whatever. Let's say one thing that 2020 has done for us, not just to us, but for us, is that it has pulled back the curtain in the world, and it's shown you the real quality of the people around you. It's shown you the character of your local politicians. It's shown you what the foundations of your society are built upon.
Yeah.
And to me, and it ain't healthy. It's not as healthy as the polished veneer would indicate with that curtain not pulled back.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's important to look at these things because these were problems that existed way before 2020.
Yeah.
One thing that it has shown me is the degree to which trauma is boiling under the surface for so many people. Individual traumas and collective traumas. It's one thing to think that you understand your neighbors, your family, your coworkers, the people close to you when everything is copacetic. But the stuff that is the real driver of their personality and their perspective comes to the surface in trying times.
Yeah.
Where do you even start with the trauma stuff? I think that human beings are largely traumatized in different ways. Some people deal with it better than others. Some people have done a lot of internal work, or they've sensed that they had to do internal work through yoga and meditation and eating right and religious conviction and just whatever it is that helps you deal with trauma. But others haven't. They haven't begun that process of recognizing and healing. And so when you have something that's like the boogeyman of the virus, where you've all got to wear these masks, and let's just take the masks, for example, which to my thinking as a scientifically inclined person is not the most effective way to deal with a viral contagion. But there's other people that are deer in the headlights, man. You see it in their eyes. Their eyes are terrified.
Yeah.
Not only do they have masks on, but they've got gloves on. They've got a welding mask on. They live in a world of absolute fear
Yeah.
and near paralysis, and it's not just because it isn't because they're afraid of a pandemic. It's because this pandemic thing is triggering something inside of them that's traumatic, probably from young adulthood or adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we still, particularly older generations, they were hit as children, right? They were spanked as kids, or worse, right? Our parents treated their kids with threats of abandonment if they were asking too many questions, with being physically hit if they did something wrong. And it's hard for us to put ourselves back into the mind of a child as an adult, because as an adult, a spanking doesn't mean anything. The words that we say as an adult, it doesn't really connect with us. But as a kid, they're catastrophic.
Yeah.
They're super catastrophic. And, if you grow up with parents that have this attitude towards you of, because I said so, not because they will reason with you to try to explain things, but will, in various types of brutal ways, treat you as, deal with you as a because I said so, and if you don't, you're gonna get hit. It's no surprise to me that it creates adults in a society that will go along with a government or authority figures whose authority isn't based on any type of reason or logic, mm-hmm. or articulated arguments or any arguments, but it's a because I said so.
Yeah.
It's because if you don't, we're going to throw you in a cage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now the normal reaction for a healthy adult would be, the hell you are. Like, first of all, everything you're saying is totally dumb. And second, try it. We're not going to take this anymore. We're not going to tolerate this stuff. But if you're traumatized kids who grow up into adults, you're going to, not only are you going to tolerate living in a world like that, a because I said so world, but if people start to disagree with the authority figures, you're going to freak out because you know what's going to come next, right? You're going to get hit.
Right.
And so you're going to try to suppress people around you that are going against what the false authority is trying to tell you to do and believe.